Here we have our test of two 980 Ti G1 gamings in SLI. Now the biggest challenge we found is to keep this top card cool. And we have it here in our Cosmos 2 test case, and what we ended up doing is we ended up replacing the side fans here with two Alpha Cooler Master Sigilflow X fans, which really made a big difference. That got us at least under 70 degrees Celsius on the top card. But what we've done eventually ended up doing with our test rig, we've got a Corsair RAM cooler there and a Corsair RAM cooler here to just force a bit of airflow away from this card here, because the big challenge we found is that you keep cycling the air back around in this SLI setup here. So the bottom card consistently stays about 20 degrees cooler than the top card, which is a bit of an issue. But overall the setup seems to have worked quite well. And yes, let's have a look at what the results are.
So here's the results we got with the SLI 980 Ti G1 Gamings. Firstly, let's look at the user bench results. This is a little less relevant because we've got it in a different test setup, as our Good Place to Start doesn't have a large enough power supply to run both these cards, and we expect it to be CPU limited on the Good Place to Start platform. So we've actually used our 4960X, which is our 6-core platform with 32 gig RAM, also clocked at 4.4 gigahertz. Now, what we saw is with adding the SLI here, we went from 102% to 117% on the gaming performance, which is a 15% result. Compared to the Good Place to Start computer, however, the desktop and the workstation results is quite a bit more, and that went from 65 to 89, which is a 37% increase, and from 49 to 88%, which is a 80% increase. So, but that's mainly due to the platform being the higher end platform we're using here. As you can see, our CPU is a little bit overclocked, so we scored an 88th percentile. The 980 Ti's, I don't think this test really picks up the SLI properly, because we only went from a 136 to a 149%, which is only a 9% increase here. However, the specific one here does score on the 99th percentile, so I think it sees both graphics cards as one together or something along those lines. But if we look at Firestrike, here's where we start to see some more real results. With a single 980 Ti, we got 14,300, and we've jumped up to 21,293. That's a 48% increase, which is quite respectable, and that puts us above the 4K gaming PC, and it gives us above 98% of results available. So that is really an excellent one. But if we move on to TimeSpy, which is the newer benchmark, we actually saw a bigger increase here. Here we jumped from 5,499 all the way to 9,010 with the two cards. That's a 67% increase. Now that holds well for the newer titles, which is all we're going to test with this setup, because the older ones really don't need it. But we got a 67% increase in our TimeSpy score, which is really quite significant. So that is excellent. Now, the biggest challenge we found on this computer was Ashes of the Singularity. So let's jump on in here. Here's what we got with on the same computer, same setup, with a single 980 Ti. We saw the CPU could handle a graphics card up to 78 frames per second, but we could only score average of 38 frames per second, and almost everywhere we were graphics card limited. And this is on 4K with crazy settings. As you can see here, the CPU score is quite a bit higher in most areas than the total score, this showing that we are seriously limited there. Now, if we go to the SLI, other way around. If we go to the SLI setup, you'll see our CPU bound frames has dropped down all the way to 53. And the reason for this is it seems to really take a lot of the system resources to run the SLI setup. So it's not the same as running a larger single graphics card, which is unfortunately expected, but quite disappointing. So here what we saw is we jumped from 38 frames to 51, which is a respectable jump, and you really do notice the difference in gameplay. The game is now really playable at absolute maximum settings, but as you can see here, a lot of the time we're actually waiting on the system and not on the graphics cards themselves. But we did still see a 34% increase, which is very impressive, and it's nice scaling for the two 980 Ti's. If we set the settings a little bit lower and we go to the extreme settings, what we've got here is with a single unit, with a single card we were at 44 frames per second average, and we could get a 75 frames per second max. But if we jump into the SLI setup, you see we got 52.8 frames. We only got about 1 and a bit frames per second more than we did at crazy settings, and the reason for this, we're now more of the time limited by the system as we go into lower detail settings. And just to illustrate that, we just ran one test at 2K as well. Here's the 2K crazy settings, was at 43 frames per second, with a little bit limited by the system, but mostly not. But as soon as we introduced the SLI, we got 54.6 frames per second, but you can see we're 100% CPU limited here. I mean, for large batches, 0% of the time we were waiting for the graphics card, and for medium batches only 0.2%. So for 2K, SLI probably doesn't make any sense, because you're going to be system limited, not limited by anything else. Now, just out of interest, this was a capture from me playing in-game at 4K crazy settings. Okay, the drop down there, but we were seeing typically about a 50% CPU capacity usage, which I think just means it's ignoring the hyperthreading and actually running the CPU flat out. But the very interesting thing we see here is, if you look down here with the RAM, is this is a 32 gig setup, and we only had 2.6 gig free. That means we actually managed to use about 29 gig of RAM. So if you're looking at a high-end setup like this, and especially if you're looking for a SLI configuration, definitely go for 32 gigs of RAM, as 16 gigs would severely limit the system. As you would have saw in the initial video, we really spent a lot of time optimizing the cooling for the SLI setup. We managed to keep our CPU at just under 50 degrees Celsius with running at basically full use, and the top GPU was the big challenge, because initially this was running closer to 70. We got it to be stable at under 60, and the second one at about 50. As you can see, we're running maximum fan speed on the top card and almost maximum on the second card. During long periods of gameplay, we found both end up in a situation where it's maximum, and this creeped up into the low 60s and this into the low 50s. But overall, setup worked really, really well. Now, the next game we tried was Ark. Now, the reason for the funny screenshot here is to show we're still getting about 17 frames per second, which we've assumed meant we're not using the second graphics card. And when we did some captures here, we confirmed that we're still only using the single graphics card, so the engine isn't yet SLI compatible. And this is one of the big challenges with SLI. It won't help you in all games, so we'd only really recommend this if you already have one card where you would want to add a second one, which has now come down in price. But just out of interest, remember we're only using one card here, and we're actually using 22 gig of RAM here in Ark. So Ark, again, probably if it's one of the games you're going to be playing a lot, rather go for 32 gig RAM in that case as well. Here we have fractured space, and it seems to not be as SLI friendly. This is running on the Unreal Engine number 4, and we're seeing basically no real gain from SLI. We're still seeing around 60 frames per second. We can see some usage on the second card, but very, very little. If there's a gain, it's about 5 or 10 frames per second, which is a lot less than what you would expect from going to an SLI setup. Here we have Project Cars running an SLI. Unfortunately, I would usually play over steering wheel, so it's very difficult when everything is turned off without a steering wheel. But we're seeing nice high frame rates, 116, 117 frames per second. The thing which I find more interesting, on the other screen, I've got the resources used open, and we're actually using 23 gig RAM, which is for a SLI setup, and specifically this game does use a lot more RAM, so it is a good idea to have a bit extra. Only using about 33% of the CPU capacity, but I can see we're definitely using both graphics cards at virtually flat out, as their temperatures are quite high. We're seeing 60 and 52 degrees, which is sort of what we'd expect for running flat out in the setup we have here. But overall, Project Cars seems to be very friendly and work nicely with SLI. Without SLI, for perspective, we saw about 80 frames per second. So we jumped about 35 frames, which is a decent result. Okay, here we have Battlefield 4, and our frame rates are excellent. We're seeing 113, 114 frames per second here in our normal test at 4K with everything set to ultra. It seems like Battlefield really is really friendly to SLI scaling. Through the vegetation, the lowest we saw there was 111 frames. Oh yes, this is excellent. For some reason it almost seems to be slightly higher scaling. That might be due to the fact that we're now running on the 32 gig RAM system with the 6-core processor. But in this exact scene with a single card in our good place to start computer with a 6700K, we got 45 frames per second. Now we're seeing 113, 140 frames per second. But I can also tell you that they're running both graphics cards absolutely flat out. We're seeing 65 degrees in the top card, 56 on the bottom card, and a CPU temperature of 54, which is still okay for running, but we're actually using 40% of the 6-core CPU, and we're using a lot of RAM. We're using about 25 gig of RAM, so it does seem like for SLI it does want a bit more all-round system resources. But yes, as said, in this situation we don't seem to. We only saw that 111 frames once or twice, but mostly staying constant at 112 to 114 frames per second, which is excellent. So Battlefield 4 definitely SLI friendly.